The Lord be with you.
With thy spirit.
Let us pray. Direct us, O Lord, in all our doings with thy most gracious favor, and further us with thy continual help, that in all our works, begun, continued, and ended in thee, we may glorify thy holy name, and finally by thy mercy obtain everlasting life. Through Jesus Christ our Lord.
Amen.
Well, the next 5 weeks, the next 5 lectures deal with the sacrament of holy matrimony. I think this section was enlarged and expanded by Father Cantrell some time back. I've had, when I did this before, I had 1 or 2 ask if these courses needed to be this long, or this many classes dealing with matrimony. And societally, as marriage is rapid, or at least that term is being changed at a societal level, I think the more that we can be armed with ammunition as far as what holy matrimony is and why as a church and why as a society we must at all costs defend it, I think it is important that we spend a significant amount of time dealing with and looking at the sacrament of matrimony and why it plays such an important role, not only in the church. Obviously it's pivotal and critical to who we are as the body of Christ. For the smallest microcosm of the church is the family. Think about it that way. The church is simply a group of families that join together in a local area. And then, of course, the church larger is those individual microcosms that make up a diocese, and those dioceses make up a larger church. So, yes, it's critically important that we study this as the church, but also we need to study it as a society. And why the attack on marriage in our society is really one of the biggest ethical dilemmas we are facing right now. What can we do to help right that ship and right that course? So this is lecture number 17, and this is Holy Matrimony lecture number 1. Once upon a time, Mae West once said, "Marriage is a wonderful institution, but I'm not ready for institutions quite yet." Well, marriage is, of course, an institution, and it's unfortunately an institution that is falling to pieces. And in the process, everyone is getting hurt. The collapse of marriage is the result of what is happening to our civilization, of which marriage is a part. The Christian church began 20 centuries ago in a corner of the Roman Empire, and in a world which was very hostile to it. But by the end of the 4th century, it had converted that empire, spread into countries outside that empire, finally converting even Russia. And in the process, it created something called the Christian synthesis. The Christian synthesis was a set of assumptions which everyone held about the meaning of life and what the most important things in life are. It was a set of dogmas. And remember what we said a dogma is: a deeply held belief that you take for granted and never question. For instance, water runs downhill, and if a child asks his mother why water runs downhill, she might answer, "Well, honey, it just does." And when you come to a "honey, it just does," you have come to a dogma. Actually, the Christian dogma is water runs downhill because God tells it to. Why? Well, honey, he just does. These dogmas, the Christian synthesis, were the basis of Christian civilization, or Christendom, as the Roman Empire was called after its conversion. But a united Christendom lasted for only about a century. In the 5th century, barbarians from outside began to attack the empire more and more frequently and with more and more success. And the empire began to break up. At first, it split into 2 parts. In the west, where Latin was the language, and in the east, where Greek was spoken. Rome was the capital of the western part, and Constantinople was the capital of the eastern. The western part returned largely to tribalism, and after several futile attempts to restore the empire, Europe found itself divided into a number of nation states. with rival princes. Each of them claimed for himself what once only the Christian emperor had claimed, and these rivalries supplied both the opportunity and the fuel for the breakup of the church, and the disintegration went on. First, there was warfare between nations, then warfare within nations, that is, civil war. And after civil war has come revolution, guerrilla, wars of national liberation, and now terrorism. Along with this political fragmentation has come the fragmentation of the church and the end of the Christian synthesis. All that is left of the Christian synthesis is an assortment of scraps without any obvious connection to each other or to real life. The most that can be said about the Christian synthesis today is that when someone claims to be an atheist, the only God whose existence he is denying is Jehovah, Yahweh, instead of Zeus or Jupiter or Thor. As a matter of fact, the Jehovah he doesn't believe in is more than likely one I don't believe in either, since the image of God has become so distorted in our world. The Christian synthesis was the basis for our civilization, and because it has been destroyed, our civilization is headed toward chaos. As a result of all of this, to be a Christian today, a person has to be very deliberate about it, because the world he lives in is constantly misleading him as to what it means to be a Christian. He lives in a world based more and more on the same dogmas as the pagan world of the first century. More and more people today think Mae West was right. Marriage seems like a madhouse. A person would have to be crazy to get married. But marriage doesn't have to be that kind of institution. First, let's think about institutions in general. Every community has a number of needs or problems which are built in. And there are some of them which are common to all communities. But not all communities see those common problems in the same way. When a society hits upon a good solution to one of its basic needs or problems, that solution gets copied and rapidly becomes the standard solution. That is, it becomes an institution. Civilizations are different, even in those institutions which deal with the problems they have in common. For example, in the United States, if a person has a wreck and is smart, he doesn't leave the scene of an accident. That would only make things worse. But in Mexico, if he is smart, he doesn't wait around. That would only make it worse, because he would get involved with a corrupt system which runs on bribes, etc. The institutions we grow up with just seem to be part of the natural law. However, other people's institutions seem bizarre. For example, in the U.S., a man is allowed one wife at a time, and in Iran, 4 wives. And in Tibet, a woman can have 4 husbands. In the U.S., if a man is seen out with a woman who is not his wife, it is assumed that he has sex on his mind. But in Japan, it is assumed that he has poetry on his mind. A geisha is a professional cultural companion, not necessarily a prostitute. Community life is essential for human beings. We are social creatures. Institutions make community life, they make civilization possible. Human life requires a very basic thing which institutions give, because as important as justice is, it is even more important to know what the rules are. Bad rules are better than no rules at all. For example, remember when you were in some totally new situation and didn't know any of the rules, like the very first day of school. And this principle was applied by the Chinese communists during the Korean War in the brainwashing of captured Americans. The way they did it involved totally changing all of the rules for the prisoners every day, and then not telling them what the new rules were. The result was that none of them tried to escape, no one trusted anyone else, and absolutely all sense of community among the prisoners was completely destroyed. On the other hand, there is an old proverb in the Navy which is profoundly true. A taut ship is a happy ship. On a ship where the rules are clear and consistent, even though strict, the crew is happier than on a ship where the rules are lax and no one knows exactly what they are from day to day or from person to person. It is important to know where you stand. Nothing terrifies people as much as totally unstructured conditions. So we defend our institutions blindly and passionately, for the alternative is chaos. The anarchists of the last 150 years have wanted chaos because they bought into the absurd idea of the 18th century philosophers like Rousseau and his friends, who said that people are basically good and that what causes all of our trouble is human institutions themselves. They believed that if we did away with all of our institutions, we would be free, and then our own innate goodness would produce a free and happy society. That notion has become almost dogma today with many people. You hear people speak of being committed to social change without ever saying what the change will be to. Just change. But even people who speak that way in general do not want anyone to fool with their own institutions. In fact, in the last century or so, no one has been feared or resented quite so much as the anarchist, because people with common sense know that a society without rules is an unendurable chaos. The Islamic terrorists represent an even more diabolical form of anarchist. They seek to destroy our civilization in order to replace it with an Islamic one. There is a tremendous public pressure to preserve our institutions, including the institution of marriage. However, the institutions of a society are symbiotic. Their lives are intermeshed. To illustrate, foxes and rabbits living in the same environment with limited food resources are symbiotic. If the foxes get killed off, the rabbit population explodes and then eats up all the food. And then the rabbits starve, get sick, and die. So when one institution in a society changes, it puts pressure on all the other institutions to change as well. The school and the home are symbiotic. Back in the 1920s, a man named John Dewey came up with the idea that the real purpose of school was to prepare Johnny to take his place in society, to instill values in him, to build his character. His motto was, "We teach pupils, not subjects." It was an exciting new idea, and the teachers bought it, but they weren't prepared to do it. So they all went back to college and took courses in things like child psychology, and the Graduate School of Education was invented. Before then, a Spanish teacher was expected to know Spanish. A math teacher was expected to know math, etc. But the new idea was that if you know education, you can teach anything. The result was that under the old system, the education a person got in high school was better than the one a person got in college under the new system. By the 1930s, parents caught on to the idea that the school had taken on the responsibility for the formation of the character of the child, and they were off the hook. And the age of the babysitter was born. Back in the 1920s and before, when parents went out, as a rule, they took little Johnny with them, or they just simply didn't go. But beginning in the 1930s, they would leave little Johnny with a teenage girl from the neighborhood. The first time that happened to little Johnny, he got a shock, a trauma. I wonder if Mommy and Daddy are coming back. When after a while he learns that they will. He has something else to deal with. Mommy and Daddy have a life that leaves me out of it, and he feels rejected, not secure. And he has less exposure to the example of his parents as a result of the institution of the babysitter. Then in the 1950s, the Russians launched Sputnik, and we discovered that they were producing better engineers than we were. And then the emphasis shifted back toward the solid subjects. The result was that the high school students of the 1950s got a better education than their parents had. Their parents became a lost generation. Furthermore, after that, there was no one accepting responsibility for the formation of children, the character of children. And then we got the youth culture. In the youth culture, young people look only to each other for their values and their ideals, and maybe to some adults who themselves have never actually grown up, and the results are tragic. Countless millions of lives are fouled up and being wasted as a result. Youth have ceased to learn from exposure to the examples of their parents all day long, day in and day out. Now, with few exceptions, young people who do not have a clue about what life is all about are looking to other youth for the answers to the questions of life, to youth who are in the same boat that they are, and also without a clue. Most families turned over the age-old responsibility to the schools, and they welcomed it as a liberation. Now, nobody is bearing that responsibility, but only families can do it. And God has placed that responsibility on the shoulders of the parents. And let me add a footnote there, in connection with the church. In connection with the church. So that's another caveat to remember. But the profound changes in the school, there have been others in our society just as deep, which have put severe pressure on the family. For instance, throughout human history until the middle of the 20th century, everyone, at least in the temperate zone, lived in an economy of scarcity. That produced what some people had called the Protestant work ethic, which said, work as hard as you can to satisfy the needs of you and your family, and then work a little bit more for your neighbor who can't quite make it. That, my friends, is what social justice actually is, not depending on someone else to do it for you. But when we passed from an economy of scarcity to an economy of plenty, the Protestant work ethic seemed obsolete. But there are signs that we may see the economy of scarcity return, and at any rate, much of the world has never left it. When a society changes the way it perceives one of its basic common problems, then the institution that deals with that problem has to change. And when one institution changes, it puts pressure on all those connected with it to change as well. If they do not change, they tend to become inefficient, and the pressure for them to change gets even greater. Change in circumstances bring new problems, and changes the way old problems are understood. So there is always a part of society which wants to tinker with institutions and make them more efficient. They are the liberals. And likewise, there is always a segment which wants to preserve the institution. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. And these are the conservatives. This is normal, and usually it's healthy. It can lead to measured and reasonable adaptation to new circumstances, but when there is intense confrontation between the two forces, the situation is ripe for revolution. Today, within most of us, there is just such a tug-of-war over the institution of marriage. Many of us have, more or less, the romantic notion of what marriage ought to be. A cottage in the suburbs, Daddy comes driving home from work, two beautiful children and a dog are playing in the yard. They run to greet Daddy with outstretched arms, crying, "Daddy, Daddy, Daddy." Daddy picks them up, swings them around. His beautiful wife comes to the door in a frilly apron and tells them that supper is ready. They sit down to supper by candlelight to enjoy a meal of all sorts of delicious food, which Mother has just finished cooking, and they laugh and they talk and they enjoy each other's companies. And that does not happen today in 1 out of 1,000 families, probably out of 10,000 or 100,000. On the other hand, we have also absorbed more or less the modern liberal notions. We ought to have equality of the sexes at all costs. Marriage should be democratic. Wives ought to be free to do what they choose with their own bodies, etc. And then these two ideals are in conflict within each of us and between us. We're damned if we do and we're damned if we don't. So both in society and within each of us, there's a great deal of stress. And to make matters worse, we no longer know what the rules for behavior between men and women are. Within the last 150 years, the Christian consensus on marriage has completely collapsed. What we expect from marriage has changed. What we do about it has changed. For example, in 1910, a suitor asked the girl's parents for the permission to court. In 1930, he asked their permission to marry her. In 1950, they announced their marriage after it had happened. And today, lots of people just live together for a while, and then maybe they get married and maybe they don't. We look for different things in a mate than people once did. For instance, Daniel Boone would have wanted a wife who was strong, who could shoot straight, who could do a full day's work while pregnant, and could bear him lots of sons. Romantic love would have been an unexpected extra. Once upon a time, we expected our children to marry people like the children of our best friends, with the same background as our own. But now the daughter of a Polish Roman Catholic parents who was born in Gary, Indiana, goes off to college, meets the son of a southern Indiana hardware merchant and a member of the Church of Christ. They get married, and all they have in common is 4 years of college. In 1920, in the South, in the summertime, families would sit out in the yard and visit with their neighbors. Meanwhile, the children played hare and the hounds all around the neighborhood until it got cool enough to go to bed. But today, yards serve no purpose usually except to put distance between you and your neighbors whom you've never met. In 1920, if the wife worked outside the home, she worked alongside her husband. The family had breakfast together. Often Daddy came home for lunch. The whole family had supper together, but today they may actually have no meals together on a regular basis. In those days, a child's best friend was likely to be the child of his parents' best friends. Today, parents frequently don't even know who their children's friends are. If mother could not discipline Johnny, she might say she would tell his daddy when he got home. Today, if there is a daddy in the home, he looks up from the sports page or the TV and says to his wife, "Honey, can't you make your child behave?" In 1930, a woman who got divorced was a social outcast. Members of a ladies' bridge club would be scandalized if a woman who had gotten a divorce did not have the decency to resign from the club. But today it's perfectly acceptable. In fact, half of the people who get married get divorced sooner or later. 50% of marriages end in divorce. The social pressures to keep marriages together have completely evaporated. In this society, we are in a severe sexual identity crisis. Of course, each of us knows what his or her own sex is. We do not have to go to the doctor or for a physical exam to find out which we are. However, now at the beginning of the 21st century, even this is being questioned with the almost militant force with which the LGBTQI LMNOP community wishes to obliterate any notions of masculinity and femininity by blurring any lines whatsoever that speak of sexual norms. But what we do not know is how a man or a woman is to behave in 1,000 different social situations. There are no longer any role definitions for men and women. During the last 200 years, we've had an almost complete reversal of the social roles of men and women. What men used to do and what was once regarded as masculine came to be thought of as a sissy. And what women once considered feminine came to be thought of as masculine. So in the last 30 years or so, even those assumptions have been abandoned. Every act of courtesy which came to be paid by men to women 200 years ago was paid by women to men. For example, when George Washington entered the room, Martha stood up. She stood behind his chair, and she seated him at the dinner table. She held his coat for him, opened doors for him, served him first at dinner. But now all bets are off. There are now no agreed upon rules for man-woman conduct. Historically, our civilization is the blending of Semitic, Hellenistic, and Viking cultures. All three of them agreed on at least one thing, namely the defined roles of men and women. And when those cultures blended, they had no conflict on that subject. They agreed upon the rules. Remember, bad rules, bad roles are better than none at all. From prehistoric times, man's job has been culture and warfare. By culture, I mean all of the intangible things which make human life different from animal life. And women's roles historically have been what is illustrated by the following quotation. Who can find a virtuous woman? For her price is far above rubies. The heart of her husband doth safely trust in her, so that he shall have no need of spoil. She will do him good and not evil all the days of her life. She seeketh wool and flax, and worketh willingly with her hands. She is like the merchant ships. She bringeth her food from afar. She riseth also while it is yet night, and giveth her meat to her household, and a portion to her maidens. She considereth a field, and buyeth it. With the fruit of her hand she planteth a vineyard. She girdeth her loins with strength, and strengtheneth her arms. She perceiveth that her merchandise is good. Her candle goeth not out by night. She layeth her hands to the spindle, and her hands hold the distaff. She stretcheth out her hand to the poor, yea, she reacheth forth her hands to the needy. She is not afraid of the snow for her household, for all her household are clothed with scarlet. She maketh herself coverings of tapestry. Her clothing is silk and purple. Her husband is known in the gates when he sitteth among the elders of the land. She maketh fine linen and selleth it, and delivereth girdles unto the merchant. Strength and honor are her clothing, and she shall rejoice in time to come. She openeth her mouth with wisdom, and her tongue is the law of kindness. She looketh well to the ways of her household, and eateth not the bread of idleness. Her children rise up and call her blessed, her husband also, and he praiseth her. Many daughters have done virtuously, but thou excellest them all. Favor is deceitful, and beauty is vain. But a woman that feareth the Lord, she shall be praised. Give her the fruit of her hands, and let her own works praise her in the gates. That is Proverbs chapter 31, verses 10 through 31. Historically, a woman's role has been babies and business. Our own word economics comes from the Greek word which means the management of the household, economia, which you hear the word economy when you say that one out loud. Margie, how would you say that in? Economia. So you've got that, sounds like the word economics. Throughout history, the primary basis for the division of labor between men and women has been that women have babies. For example, a healthy 17-year-old girl would probably outrun and outswim me, but let her get 8 months pregnant and that would be a different story. The poorest woman at having babies is better than the best of men, and that extends beyond the event of giving birth. Having a baby limits a woman's mobility. A young infant needs almost continuous access to his mother's body. Until the 20th century, children were normally nursed until they were 2 or 3 years old, and the mother could move around about as fast as a 2-year-old baby could toddle, and then she would become pregnant again. So she stayed home and did the kinds of jobs she could do sitting down. So she is the one who made the arrowheads, not the husband. He went hunting with them. Men did the work that required traveling. To illustrate, back in 1820, the men of a Comanche tribe went out and killed a buffalo. Then they sent word back to the women where it was, and the women went out and skinned it, butchered it, tanned the hides, and eventually made moccasins of it. Now notice, no woman ever died as the result of skinning a buffalo, but many a brave got trampled to death in the midst of a stampeding herd. The men did the dangerous work. And when a decision had to be made about something like going to war with another tribe, it was the mobile ones, the men, who came together to make the decision. The immobile ones, the women, stayed home and attended to the domestic matters. Now let's go back 1,000 years to a Scandinavian village where the men meet regularly in the local tavern. One time, one of them says, "My wife is always complaining about the smell of garbage which everybody throws out in the street." And another one says, "So does mine." So they all discuss it thoroughly and come up with a solution. They decide that every family will provide a big crockery jug with a lid, which will sit outside the house. The village will hire a man with a cart and a donkey and come by on a schedule and collect the garbage. So Lars comes home and says to his wife, "Guess what, honey? We've solved the garbage problem." And he proceeds to tell her the plan. What Lars has done is to bring the culture, the civilization, the institution of the larger community back into the family. For that reason, historically, he has been considered the head of the family. In the 17th century, people in England were making a lot of money exporting wool to the continent of Europe, where there was a large cottage industry that wove the wool into fabric. Then the woolen fabric was imported back into England, where it was made into garments. And since the fabric was woven by hand, it was said to be manufactured, a combination of the two Latin words manus, meaning hand, and factus, meaning made. But now, manufactured means the opposite of handmade. Today in the Ozark Mountains, you can see signs along the side of the road advertising tufted bedspreads, handmade, guaranteed not manufactured. Mobile homes are advertised as manufactured homes. How did that happen? Well, one day in the 18th century, an Englishman was looking at a vacant barn, and because of the recent availability of steam power, he had a vision. He imagined there was a row of 20 spinning wheels along one wall, all spinning away, making woolen yarn, and along the opposite wall were 20 looms and 40 people busily making yarn into fabric. And with that, the factory was born. The European cottage industry was doomed, and the Industrial Revolution was underway. The people who had the skill to do the work were women and children. So for the next 100 years, the factory workers were actually women and children. The long-range outcome of the Industrial Revolution was the creation of a new leisure class, the housewife. Leisure is not idleness, but rather the freedom from the constant preoccupation with the necessities of life, so that one has time for culture. Leisure is the prerequisite for culture. So prior to the American Civil War, all school teachers were men. But during the war, all able-bodied men were in the army. That left no one to teach school, and a surplus of young ladies with no one to marry. So the ones who could read and write became the school teachers. When the war was over, so many men never came back that the temporary shortage became permanent, and the women stayed on as school teachers. And after a generation, it became the norm. 100 years later, in the middle of the 20th century, it was still common for small town school boards to have a rule that a school teacher had to resign if she got married unless she had gotten their permission first. And I actually went back and I found, it was floating around the internet, a copy of a teacher's contract. I bet many of you saw it, that had those stipulations laid out about pregnancy and getting married and the like. In England, the first women school teachers did not appear until the First World War. The change there has never been as complete as it has been in this country. It is still common in England to have men teachers in grade school. Today, the chief supporters of cultural activities are still women, even when their husbands write the checks. And the majority of political party volunteers are women and retired people. Women entering the workforce is not an invasion of traditional male activities. They are merely reclaiming activities which had been taken over by men 200 years ago. However, for them to be doing it outside the home in the larger community is an invasion of what was traditional male territory. In a study reported in Psychology Today some years ago, a group of 3 or 4-year-old children were each given a box of crayons and a sheet of paper, in the middle of which there was a square. The majority of the girls decorated the inside of the square, and the boys decorated the border and left the inside of the square blank. It was suggested that the results might have something to do with the way we are made sexually. And in the act of sexual intercourse, the woman receives into herself from outside. The man goes out of himself to enter that which is other than himself. Historically, women are oriented inwardly, men are oriented outwardly. Women talk about inward matters like feelings and motives. Men talk about what people do and largely ignore the subject of motives and feelings. This can be symbolized by a scene in a Comanche Indian village in 1820. An Indian couple is standing back to back at the entrance to their teepee. The woman is looking inside to make sure everything is all right inside with the children. The man is looking out into the village to see what is going on out there. As a result of the Industrial Revolution, man has taken over the responsibility for the material well-being of his family, and he has abdicated his historical role for providing for the cultural well-being of his family, for the quality of his family's life. However, whoever determines the lifestyle, the value system of the family, is the functional head of the family. At the beginning of the movement to give women the vote, the big argument against it went like this: voters need to be well informed, and to be sufficiently informed, one has to read, and everybody knows women don't read. Except old-maid school teachers, of course. But today, the majority of those who use the public libraries are women and retired people. And today it is almost always the woman who sets the direction in cultural affairs for the family. She is the leader. She is therefore functionally the head of the family. The man knows he is supposed to be the head of the family. He thinks mistakenly that this means he is supposed to be boss. He knows deep inside himself that he is inadequate and incompetent. So he's frustrated and irritated, and all he can think to do is to throw his weight around, only to discover that his family resists it and rebels against it. Furthermore, there is another factor. A man named Konrad Lorenz has discovered a principle about the way animals behave called the territorial imperative, and it also applies to human behavior. To illustrate, there are two families living next door to each other. One has a collie dog, and the other has a German shepherd. When the collie goes into the yard of the German shepherd, it gets beaten up. And when the German shepherd goes into the yard of the collie, it gets beaten up. Courage varies in proportion to the nearness to home base. Well, when husband and wife quarrel, it is almost always on her territory, and it is not uncommon to feel like a collie dog in the yard of a German shepherd. Nevertheless, the husband is supposed to be the head of that house. In an ordinary family, daddy is out and gone by the time breakfast is over, and now the mother may be also. From time to time he is born. From the time he is born until the time he starts school, a boy is now under the exclusive control of women: mother, female daycare worker, babysitter. Then he starts school, and he is instructed in the ways of the larger world almost entirely by women. There is no way he can be expected to assume responsibility for the leadership of a family, because the moment there's a crisis, he looks to the nearest woman and says, "What'll we do?" And she tells him. We have raised a generation of gutless men, or as C.S. Lewis would say in The Abolition of Man, men without chests, and strong-minded women, present company accepted, of course. Until very recently, the laws were written on the assumptions of an earlier time when the man actually was the head of the family. But the present reality is just the opposite. Women are asking that the laws be changed to fit the facts. They have the game, now they want the rules. And their demand is reasonable. If they're going to carry the responsibility, they ought to have the authority. But in general, neither men nor women want the woman to be the head of the family. The most common complaint of women in marriage counseling, besides "he doesn't communicate," is "he can't accept any responsibility." And the subject for next week will be on the subject of romanticism and love.